So brilliant. Thank you, everybody. My name's Kirsty Robson. I'm the Projects and Community Development Manager here at SCoJeC. And thank you for coming along to this event, Does Scotland Have a Problem with Religion? Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our panellists, starting with Mark Gardner, who I'm sure many of you know. Originally from Glasgow, Mark is the Chief Executive of CST, the Community Security Trust, having previously been their Director of Communications and Research. He joined CST in '89 and is a leading commentator and writer on contemporary anti-Semitism. Mark has represented British and European Jews in a number of ways, for example, giving the keynote speech at the 2015 European Union colloquium on anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate, and giving evidence on British, Israeli and German parliamentary hearings on anti-Semitism. He's played a prominent role in the April 2018 ill-fated Jewish community leadership meeting with the then Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, and more successfully, he has worked many times with SCoJeC in meetings with the Scottish Government and Police Scotland, and has just been a huge supporter of everything we've done. So Mark, thank you so much for coming along this evening and for everything you've done for us. Pleasure. Also delighted to introduce Professor Duncan Morrow, an academic and community activist, currently the Director of Community Engagement at Ulster University in Belfast, at a time when the university is going through its biggest ever transformation in the city by relocating its largest campus into the centre of the city. I can't imagine how difficult that must be at this time of life. His interest in diversity, interdependence, nurturing better intercommunity and international relationships and questions of peace and conflict have shaped both his university career and his activities outside of university. For 9 years, he was the Chief Executive of the Northern Ireland Community Relations Council, and since then has worked with the Scottish Government as the chair of independent ministerial advisory groups on tackling sectarianism and on hate crime, prejudice, community cohesion, and lots of other really interesting topics, which I'm sure we'll get into later this evening. And lastly, thank you, Duncan, so much for joining us. Unfortunately, I know many of you were here to listen to Anas Sarwar, MSP, as well. However, due to some unforeseen circumstances, Anas isn't actually able to join us this evening, but he has kindly provided us with a video message to screen. And if you have any questions for him, anything you want to ask, you can either send them to his parliamentary email and say that you were at this event, or send them to us at SCoJeC and we will pass that along. So with that, what I think we might do first of all is screen that video from Anas, and then we can bounce off and get into the conversation with Mark and Duncan. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. And with that, we can hear from Anas before we get started.
Good evening, shalom, salam. I'm sorry I can't be with you this evening, but I did want to send a short message of solidarity and support. I think the discussion that you're going to have this evening is of fundamental importance, not just to the Jewish community, but I think of fundamental importance to communities across our country, and indeed of fundamental significance for our country here in Scotland and across the UK. There is no doubt that prejudice and hate is on the rise. There is no doubt that certain sections of our society feel particularly targeted, and there is no doubt that events that happen elsewhere in the world do impact on community relations and community tensions here at home. I've been doing a lot of work over the course of the last Parliament around challenging Islamophobia, but also recognising how Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in particular have such entrenched similarities. The symptoms often the same, and the impact on life chances, life opportunities and life outcomes so often the same as well. And that's why I believe that the Muslim community and the Jewish community must be allies in the fight against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. We've recently published the report on the inquiry into Islamophobia in Scotland. I would encourage you all, please, to have a look at that report and at the recommendations. I believe there are recommendations in that report that can be replicated for all forms of prejudice and hate, whether that be anti-Semitism, whether that be racism, whether that be homophobia, whether that be sexism, and other forms of prejudice and hate as well. Because I have a very simple principle, and that is that we cannot defeat any form of prejudice if we leave it to that individual community alone. We can't defeat Islamophobia if we leave it to our Muslim community. We can't defeat anti-Semitism if we leave it purely to our Jewish community. We can't defeat sexism if we leave it only to women. Just like for every other form of prejudice and hate, we can only defeat that prejudice and hate if we come together, work together, and build solidarity with each other, work for each other. And what I mean by that is, too often I think in our wider society, too often in our politics, people pick and choose. We should no longer pick and choose. We should call out and condemn all forms of prejudice and hate. We shouldn't have a hierarchy, and we shouldn't judge our condemnation or our solidarity based on what side we believe either the perpetrator or the victim is on. That needs to end. And so I want to work with our Jewish community and all our faith communities to challenge prejudice and hate in all its forms. I just want to share one other thought with you, and that's around the impact on our communities here when we see issues that happen the other side of the world. Now, I fundamentally believe, and I think there's a real job of political education required here, and I think the Labour Party, my own party, is well placed to do it or should be doing it, and that is that whatever your view on the Middle East conflict, whatever your view on the conflict between Israel and Palestine, that should not cloud our judgment when it comes to challenging Islamophobia and in particular anti-Semitism. You can be passionately pro-peace in the Middle East and also be vociferously against anti-Semitism here and across the world. And I think it's really important that we recognise that. You can see from the last violence that we saw in the Middle East that you saw a spike in anti-Semitism cases here in the UK. You also saw a spike in Islamophobia cases here in the UK as well. That shows that we must work in partnership amongst our communities and challenge Islamophobia, challenge anti-Semitism, challenge all forms of prejudice and hate. And the final point is we can't separate our political discourse from the way our communities then behave and interact with each other. Our politics of hate, our politics of division, our politics of us versus them impacts on how we treat each other as a community and the hate that then develops in our community. And particularly with the hate that develops online. Because so much of what people now do and say online is things that they would never dream about saying to someone's face. And that's why we've got to challenge, I think, the social media companies much more directly, that their platforms cannot be allowed as forums for people to amplify, to organise, to recruit, to fundraise, and to attempt to silence whole sections of our society. And I think we've got to challenge the social media companies head on to make them realise their responsibility and to challenge prejudice and hate in all of its forms. That requires legislation around our criminal justice system, around reporting of hate crimes. It requires legislation around challenging social media companies and make sure we're prosecuting people that are spreading hate online. Of course, it requires us looking at our employment market so everyone has equal access to employment, recognising there's a gendered nature to prejudice. There's a reason why Muslim women and Jewish women are particularly targeted by hate crime. But fundamentally, we defeat prejudice and hate through our education system. So how do we teach our true education and our true history here in our country? And how do we build solidarity and support through our education system so our children can learn from each other, they can go home, teach their parents, and by that teach whole communities, and through that build a fairer, more equal nation here at home, so together we can build a fairer and more equal world as well. So my solidarity to all those that are taking part in this conversation today. I look forward to following up with you. I'm really honoured to have such positive interaction with SCoJeC and other organisations across Scotland in challenging prejudice and hate in all its form. It really is a fight for all of us, and I promise you this, in the fight against anti-Semitism, I will always be an ally and a friend. Take care.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to that message from Anas. And once again, I would like to pass on behalf of Anas and his team their deepest apologies. They can't be here this evening. They really desperately wanted to. So with that, I'd like to move on to our panel who are here with us this evening, Mark and Duncan. And I'd like to just invite Mark and Duncan. Mark, you first to give your opening remarks. Thank you.
Cheers, Kirsty. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's really good to see all of you here. It's a shame that Anas couldn't join us because I think you could hear, or I could hear anyway, from his message, the way that he delivered it, that he cares deeply about this and that he understands this in ways that I think would have been very, very beneficial for this conversation. In the little bio that Kirsty read out about me, there was mention of my participation in the Jewish Community Leadership Meeting with Jeremy Corbyn back in 2018. And Basically, when you have meetings like that, you can really tell the difference between a political leader who cares genuinely about an issue and a political leader who perhaps their followers feel either rightly or wrongly that he's giving license to behaviors that I would say put them very strongly in an anti-Semitic place. So I do regret that Anas isn't here. And I think his opening, Shalom Salam, is absolutely right. And I always come back to, every time there's a war in the Middle East and I get involved in conversations with Jewish community leadership about what should our messaging be, I can never get any further than the Union of Jewish Students posters from the 1970s and 1980s that simply said on them, peace, shalom, salam. For me, that sums up essentially where the differing communities ought to be here, regardless of the Middle East, but actually especially when things are bad in the Middle East. Kirsty, did you want me to talk just now about personal experiences of anti-Semitism, or do you want to save that for the next?
You certainly can, or we can move on to that in a couple of minutes if you want.
No, I'm happy to pass over to Duncan to take his opening remarks.
Sure. Duncan, would be grateful to hear from you, and then we can get into our discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Anna said and also what Mark said there just draws attention to the fact that, first of all, we have a real problem with violence and threat and the way in which that works across the world. And of course, Scotland and Northern Ireland certainly is not immune from that. And we see it everywhere. We have a really clearly persistent issue where some people come under threat simply for some perception in the eyes of the perpetrator, which makes them a legitimate target or some kind of person who doesn't matter. So it's the dehumanizing process that is created. And I was thinking, on one way we can talk about we have a problem with difference, but there's another way to say we have a problem with indifference as well. In other words, the stories become the stories. I thought what Anna said there in his opening discussion about we cannot let these stories be only the stories of the communities which are at the hard and sharp end of it. One of my experiences very deeply in listening to communities is that one of the consequences of violence is people shrink from relationships. They shrink from relationships because relationships are threatening and they hope to rely ever more on their own strength. The reality, of course, is then that even the story of being persecuted lives in the community of the persecuted, and the outside is treated with indifference. It's not seen as something that matters because it doesn't infect people, and it can even be ignored or denied. And I think that process whereby we move from acknowledgement and recognition to denial is a really important one, because it's treated as something which is additional or something which is add-on or something which isn't core. And yet if you're at the sharp end of it, the reality shapes every decision you take. So I suppose there's an issue with that question of indifference. The overarching title of this was does Scotland have a problem with religion? And there's no doubt whatsoever that religious markers are used as one of the core lines of that distinction, because religions are ways of life. They're not only a set of philosophies, they're ways of life. And so people can be identified by anything physical, by the decision simply to attack somebody because of some aspect of their way of life. So you are essentially vulnerable in the world. And I think that but they also act sometimes as ways in which we talk again inside ourselves and learning. I think one of the greatest shalom, peace idea that Mark you're talking, we won't find great difference, I don't suppose, on that, is how do we give that expression? How do we give that expression? Simply stating it, of course, is important as we use it in a ritual way. But I think that we have to understand that it is not just an object or a ideology. It has to be expressed in our life experience and made real. And in the, I suppose, the question of how we create a culture of hospitality, which is actually one in which people are served by one another, and meet each other in a way which is not simply through the myths that are told, or through some notion that because somebody embraces a label as part of their own identity, that they lose their humanity rather than that they make their form of humanity through it. I think that is something we really have to think about. But I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation, because I think the questions that you posed to us around, our own experiences, around the way in which that comes into politics, the way, what the priorities, I think they'll come up as we go along here.
Thank you so much, Duncan. And with that, I think that the personal experience discussion is one to kind of kick us off with. So, well, Mark and then Duncan, but either personally or professionally, what have been your experiences of hate crime motivated by religion within Scotland?
Okay, so I went to Calderwood Lodge Jewish Primary School, and so my school blazer had a Jewish symbol on it. I wore a little private school cap, which in retrospect kind of singled me out and wasn't ideal to have on as I waited for the 38 bus. And kids from other slightly rougher, perhaps, schools came past the bus stop or met us on the bus. And my memories from those primary school years are, literally having my cap taken off my head or my kippah taken off my head, thrown into the traffic on Kilmarnock Road, and me kind of rushing out and rescuing them from onrushing traffic. And that kind of bullying, I think was pretty constant, but I honestly, I know a psychologist would dispute this, especially an occupational psychologist, but honestly, I don't think it really had an impact on me. And it was only in later life when I started doing this job and I started thinking about all of these things that I kind of realized even that it was particularly wrong. I then went to a state secondary, not a particularly good one, and basically religious-based racism was just the way that a lot of people spoke to each other. Again, I didn't really think anything of it. It was just, it was as natural as being told that I had spectacles or that I had a big nose or whatever. What really impacted on me, though, was two things, both of them football related. The first one was there was a Celtic Rangers match. It was at Hampden, and I was in Langside, so nearby Hampden. And I literally saw two Celtic fans being chased down the road by a lot of Rangers fans. One of the Celtic fans fell over. He was a kid of about 14 or 15. And literally the Rangers fans ended up fighting each other so that they could get into the circle that was kicking this kid whilst they lay on the ground. And that was a level of hatred that, to me, given what was being shouted, was to do with religion, not to do with football, and was totally different to anything that I personally had ever experienced or witnessed. Although maybe it's quite common if you go to Celtic Rangers matches. I don't know, I never did because I didn't. The other one was when myself and friends went to see Scotland play Morocco in 1998 in the World Cup in Saint-Etienne in France. And it was a brilliant day, an absolutely brilliant day when I was so proud to be Scottish. And then they lost 3-0 and it was absolutely awful, but only in a footballing sense. And then as we were leaving, we were quite far away from the stadium. We were heading towards where the car was parked. Jewish bunch of lads, including myself. And basically a couple of Scotland fans came past us and just made some literally passing remarks as they walked by. about how we weren't really Scottish. And I took that to be because we were Jewish. You're not really Scottish. That was all that they really said. We all had on our Scotland tops. We'd all been to the match. We'd all been very proud to be Scottish all day long. That was the one that actually impacted on me personally the most. In my professional life, if somebody reports an anti-Semitic incident to Police Scotland or to CST, then I'll get to hear about it. It will cross my desk and I'll read it. Or, as happened with the people driving through Gifnock with Palestinian flags, looking to me like they were trying to bait local Jews, then I'll get sent a copy of the footage. And these things are upsetting, and they divide into just crass, ugly racism from kids into stuff that is more political, like the flags being driven through Gifnock. The perpetrators can be of any apparent ethnicity or religion. And it's upsetting. I don't regard it as particularly different to what I see reported from other parts of the United Kingdom. And statistically, at least, I think we had 12 anti-Semitic incidents reported to CST from May when Israel was at war. And that's probably equivalent to just about a year's worth or something like that we would normally get from Scotland. So, yeah, I do think there is a problem. I'm honestly not sure if the problem is any different in Scotland to elsewhere in the United Kingdom, but I do find in my meetings with Scottish government that they have a narrative that at least sounds pretty good on it. A narrative around, a Scotland, a tartan, a weaving of a tartan. They've found good ways to express opposition to it and found good ways to express solidarity with the Jewish community on it. That's my experience relative to what I hear elsewhere, and relative also to my experiences of working with European Jewish communities in an EU context.
Thank you, Mark. And Duncan, I'd like to ask you the same question, either personally or professionally. What have been your experiences of hate crime motivated by religion within Scotland?
I'll get to Scotland in a minute. Well, I live in Northern Ireland, and today the latest non-leading news, it's not on the, it was I think about number 5 on the local news tonight, was that a nursery school which will be in the Irish language in a Protestant area can't be established because of the level of hatred directed against the woman who is Protestant setting it up. And so the issue of the threat of violence to people who are identified as some risk to the purity of the community surrounds me every day. Surrounds me every day. It has been legitimized to the point that it appears on walls, so that any child who grows up in an area which is in a sense owned or the other grows up with that as what they started with, that to move out is to move into a space where they they're foreign. The way they know they're at home is because all of that is there. And just to connect it directly in Northern Ireland, the sides adopted the Israeli and Palestinian flags as markers of their own conflict, identifying that this has something to do with the hatred of the user rather than the meaning that is imputed to those things by the people who belong to the symbols. In other words, that it shows you something, doesn't show you anything about about the people who are being targeted. It shows you something about the people and their own fears. So that's one thing. So I live in the midst of it. Second thing is, I if I'm honest, I think I have not really been affected by it in the sense that when we were looking at hate crime professionally in Scotland, or at least we said, you know, when does this actually hit people? And we said, well, it hits people in three ways at least, and there's lots of other ways as well, but at least three things. First of all, it's something which you can see because people are being targeted. There's threats, there's actual violence, and then there's threat that comes out of that, and there's intimidation which is allowed, and there's a language of violence which is absolutely not about recognition of the humanity of the other. So we call that the glass bottles problem. The next one is that's then used to create in places and out places, in groups and out groups. It becomes a mechanism by which it affects people's everyday experience and what they can expect to do, and where they can go, and what they can maybe get jobs, or the allocation of resources, or the experience that they're not allowed to be part of a Scotland football team. That's a very small example in the sense that it's very deep for the person because it's something very emotional, but it's also goes into, you know, where you can actually live, or where you can, what you can say in public, and all these kind of things. So I think that to me, that's about, you know, glass ceilings. That's about, you know, people who are allowed to be in and out. So there's glass bottles and glass ceilings. And then there is this thing about hostility, which is almost nurtured in the story of who we are. We know ourselves as not being them. And that hostility it creates people who, even when they are together, can't speak about with their truth, because they are trying to avoid tripping the wire. And so we learn to live with a certain degree of hostility, and our resentments are kept in ourselves, but also we don't know anything about how we come across to other people. So those three elements to me have been part of my experience of how do you do that. I grew up in a family, so I'm really not the pioneer of this at all, where my parents were part of a group who explicitly sought to live somewhere in the middle of that. I don't even want to give it a location, but simply they set up a group in Northern Ireland which was about an open village at a particular point. And that it was initially connected to the Catholic Protestant issue. And they had a centre, and this group, and people were able, even through the troubles to come. And that was not just eventually about our local problem. That was also about people from across the world who came in who we did not know. And I suppose I had this experience as a child of meeting people who were telling me their refugee stories, their own stories of this. And I suppose I carried that with me my whole life. I have kind of been aware that people like me, and it's not a guilt thing, but that people like me don't know what it's like, because there's no label which attaches itself to people like me, which gets me punched yet. Although eventually it might turn around, because all these years of being dominant might be the very reason why, you know, somebody might come for me now. But at the same time, I'm very aware of that that dynamic. And once you become aware of it, it becomes a story of watching people's humiliation. Humiliation, it means to be nothing, to have your worth demeaned simply by association. I think I watched, because we moved from as children from Belfast to Glasgow to Dublin, and I remember the difficulty for me was being part of groupthink. How did I stand out against my friends and still be my friends and not make myself a target? The bystander issue. I think I very, very closely identified with that, which is, I know it's wrong, but there will be a cost to me to name it, so I'm not going to bother. And so that silence question became something that I kind of have experienced. And then that question of, well, not just what do I say, but how do I say it, that it actually opens something up rather than simply gives an excuse to give the violence further. And I suppose this thing about, especially if you've watched a lot of these things, I lived in a context where there was a permissive environment. It was, in other words, it was just known that it was okay to hate certain people. And how do you stand? And nobody even told you that. It wasn't even expressed. It was just nobody stood up against when people did it. So you just learned that those were legitimate targets and you picked those up. So I suppose all of that has driven my professional life. I became interested in the question of what would reconciliation or peace look like. I became interested in the question of, and more, that's much more complicated than some kind of pious rhetoric. That means after all of that's in our history, how do we make a future together? And that becomes a really, really complicated, important, difficult question, because some of that must be about law and about certainty, and some of that has to be about building an alternative and doing something else, and some of that has to be about what we want to pass on to our children and what we want to place into the center of their life. So that has been my experience. And in Scotland, the way we did our work was listening. We really, in both cases, just spent time actually asking, what does this mean for you? And I think that story hearing has become one of my questions. Where do we hear these stories? Not just where do we tell them, but how are the stories heard of these experiences? So that has been very much something that I wrestle with. How do you carry that and then express that and work out of that something new comes into it? So those are just a few reflections on the topic.
Thank you, Duncan. That was incredibly powerful. I'd like to sort of go on to one of the key topics that we talk a lot about when we discuss the idea of these hate crimes with faith communities, is how communities can kind of come together and the shared experiences that these faith communities can have. And Mark, I know this is something that Anas was keen to talk about as well. We've recently seen rises in religiously motivated hate crimes due to conflicts elsewhere in the world. And what would you say is the requirement for communities to come together and play a part with each other in preventing those from becoming as extreme as they often have been?
I think it's hugely important, and it's even very difficult to talk about the anti-Semitism, the Jew hatred, let's call it what it is, because anti-Semitism is a stupid word. The Jew hatred that happened in May. Statistically, the stuff that was reported to CST overwhelmingly was framed by Free Palestine. And that framing Free Palestine appeared to be taken as giving license to Jew hatred. In 2014, the last time Israel was at war with Hamas, the most common expression in the anti-Semitic instance was Hitler was right. And Hitler was right trended in Arabic, and it was used in English, and indeed someone said it to me outside the House of Commons when I was on my way to do an interview at Millbank on anti-Semitism, and specifically the phenomenon of Hitler was right. I couldn't believe it, that it actually happened to me on the way to do the interview. And the point is that there's always a certain level of racism against any given minority community. But when you have a trigger event, it causes a surge, right? And the nature of the trigger event will then be reflected in the apparent ethnicity or religion or whatever of the perpetrators, and in the language that is used. And when the trigger is a conflict in the Middle East, in particular a conflict that begins with the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem and then moves to Gaza, the majority of the perpetrators would seem to be Muslim. And I would like to say that they're jihadis or they're Islamists or they're this politics or that politics, but I'm not able to say that, because the reality of it is that, for example, a quarter of all the anti-Semitic incidents reported to CST took place within schools. And this was Jewish kids, essentially, and Jewish teachers being targeted by Muslim kids. And this is a phenomenon that we've seen with other Jewish communities. We've seen what it's done to the numbers of French Jews who feel that they can no longer live in France and therefore go to live in Israel, or move to London, or move to North America. Similarly, with Belgian Jews and with Dutch Jews. And CST's mission really is defined by the fact that British Jews should not end up in that place. When we had all the problems with the Labour Party 2 years ago, the profile of perpetrators was entirely different. It was not that. It was something else entirely, right? So the fact is that from where I'm sitting at CST, really any politicized sector of society can come out with the anti-Semitism if the conditions appear to give license for people to behave in those ways. And ultimately, it's for the people whom the perpetrators respect or might listen to in some way to remove that license and to make them know that it's unacceptable and that they have to bottle it up. And perhaps they might even learn not to be racist, but at the very least, it's not acceptable. You have to bottle it up. What can communities do? I just want to quickly run through what CST does, right? CST was very, very involved in the creation of Tel Mama, which is basically the Muslim communal organization that measures anti-Muslim attacks, MAMA, measuring anti-Muslim attacks, Tel Mama. We told them of CST's experience in hate crime collection, working with police, working with government, with local government as well, how you set up a third-party reporting system, how you do this whole hate crime thing. And we worked with them and we sat on their board with them and we work very closely with them to this day. We set up an organization called Stand Up, which is Jewish and Muslim educators going side by side into secondary schools and side by side delivering education against anti-Muslim hatred and against anti-Jewish hatred. So for example, in the 2020 to 21 academic year, they delivered 336 different sessions for 11,149 pupils in 54 schools. And they worked very, very hard during May and during June when the conflict was going on. And basically schools don't have a clue how to deal with this particular problem that they experienced during May and June. And Stand Up is just about the only thing available to talk honestly about the problem and to try and deal with the problem. So we're very proud of that. We also have something called SAFE, whereby we take CST's experience at practical security measures and we make it available for people from other faith communities, indeed other targeted groups, for any protected characteristic, to learn from our experience of what security looks like, how you perform it, how you liaise with police, local government, etc. SAFE's now been in operation for 3 years, and we've had 3,286 people from 1,523 places of worship attend 112 talks in person and 43 webinars during the coronavirus period. I'm reeling off these stats because they're all in my reports that I've pulled up on my computer screen here. This is practical work whereby as Jews we take our hard-earned experience of security and of racism and racist attacks, and how to at least measure it and do our best to counter it and do our best to discuss it. And we take that as, in Yiddish, the expression is tachlis, which basically means brass tacks, something meaningful. So that's what we do. We also, as an organization that deals with physical security, we also encourage interfaith, because essentially, as Duncan was saying, you know, out groups and in groups and noble places and a culture that defines by hostility to others and imaginary portrayals of others can only be broken down by personal interaction. So you have to take every opportunity that you can to have those interactions, to break down those stereotypes, and to show that ultimately we're just all the same, we're just all getting on. And if we're to import overseas conflicts into a UK situation, then we've all had it. That doesn't quite fit the Northern Ireland conflict, but it's the one that most certainly fits the Jewish experience.
Thanks, Mark. And something that's just made me think of, and Duncan, maybe you're well placed to answer this, is, you know, lots of communities have sort of grown up on that idea of that baseless hatred almost being ingrained. I think you said it yourself, it's something that people grow up knowing about, and it is quite a difficult thing to undo when it's all you've ever known, essentially. What would be your suggestions, and how, Duncan, how would you feel that the best way to go about unlearning that ingrained part of people's personalities and communities are?
Very interesting. I mean, I think that question of having to recognize that there's both a short and a long process there. There's the horrendous shock that violence creates when it becomes visible and people see it, and responding to that. But there's also the acknowledgement that, especially when it's politicized and in this kind of group context and hate crime context, the violence is the end of the iceberg. That the iceberg sits on things which I'm not prepared to acknowledge my connection to it. Almost the shock of the violence almost allows me to walk away from that. And so I think I'm with the good guys, but in fact, so much of my everyday life is tied up with the things that produce some of the stuff. So I think there's a kind of a learning process, a very hard learning process, and it goes in this stuff about, you know, institutionalized racism or anti-Semitism or sectarianism, or whichever one you want to use. But what it basically means is that as we grow up in institutions, we become part of them, and we take them on without thinking about this normalization of this. So I think there's the unlearning part is, first of all, unlearning the idea that we somehow don't belong to that. We have to start asking a question all the time, which is, you know, not do I belong, but how do I belong to this? How do I belong to this? I think that's a good question, because it doesn't preclude the answer. It doesn't give you a cheap answer. It doesn't say, you know, everybody's bad and all this kind of thing either, but it does say we have to explore, we have to learn, we have to learn our way out of this. So I think you're pointing at something. Just in terms of, you know, you know, what Mark was talking about there. I mean, actually, in a sense, all that Northern Ireland has done is imported into, if you like, the United Kingdom. But the dynamics that you identified in a very small way, I suppose, are parts of things we've had to learn. Politics, political projects, which are exercised on people in terms of create targets which then politics blesses as legitimate, and that I think is very dangerous. We have to watch when these things enter into the space of negotiation and power, that they're not taken for granted. And I think that is an escalation which really matters, because politics creates a blanket over which violence is transformed all of a sudden into something which is which is somehow given blessing or some kind of ideological reason, and is not seen for what it is. And it's seen from the point of view of the ideology rather than from the point of view of the people who find themselves on the end of it. So I think, there are things which create really important issues around leadership, around people in public space, how they articulate, how they behave, what they say takes on a really important role, because visibility sets patterns, it sets norms, it starts giving permission. And I think that one of the things that is really, really important is that we think about our visible presence and we act our way into a different future. Another thing that really comes to mind in terms of how people think about, and it would be very interesting to talk to Mark around the security issue, is that a really sharp distinction between keeping safe and revenge. So this issue of really making sure that this isn't about revenge, but it is about practical security measures, which are about protecting people while de-escalating the overall level of hatred in the community. And I think that's really, really important. And I'm sure there's deep learning inside the Jewish community of how people have tried to do both of those things at once. And I'm pretty sure that the exposure of violence to perpetrators at some level or other involves not just countering it, but contrast. In other words, exposing it, making it visible for what it is. And I am interested in how we create places where that is made visible, whether that's in, and I think media can be important there, but I also think relationships can be very important there. I think, again, how people speak in the public space is there. And I think that we need to, one of the things that I've had to kind of think about here is how do we move from simply the condemnation of violence, which is unchallenged as far as I'm concerned. That's not to set it aside. It's simply to say that's only the starting point. But the next step of that is to say, what is it that our society is allowing, and what are we giving permission to, so that we can turn it off at that level. I'm quite sure that some of this is not just about turning it off at the level of stopping the actual violence. It's turning off at the level of giving permission, that people who give legitimacy, who say it's okay to do this, so that it suddenly becomes not even a thinkable thing to do. And I think, if we think of, for example, approaches to violence with women or lynching that were done in communities and societies not that long ago in our own society, and we now at least have taken a view which is, we know what that was about, and we can't go on with it. That's not to say there aren't people who want to do it, but it is to say that the visibility of that has been really, really important, and that it's not given permission anymore. And I think then finally I would say to you, I think one of the things that violence does, and this kind of hatred does, is make relationships very, very uncertain and very, very frightening. And so people resort back to that which they know. And I myself, I think Mark talked about this really, I think avoid isolation, look for ways in which as far as we can keep the reality of people's lives in each other's presence. So people who do that seem to me to be really, really important. And I suppose there are so many steps there, but all of that seems to me to be kind of, we need to be much more serious about it, I suppose, not just treat it as something which would be nice to do. I think sometimes we're very blasé about some of these things. I think if you've lived in communities where violence is real, you start to realize that these are not optional extras. These are things we have to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that you said there just really resonated with me, which is, violence is the end of the iceberg. It's not the beginning. And I think one of the things we have to really focus in on with that in mind is, how do we stop it getting to that point? And I think leadership, power, policy plays a huge part in aiming to prevent it getting to that stage. So I'm sure there are lots of individual policies and things we could talk about, but really I'd be interested to know, what would you say, and I know we've had questions from a few audience members about this as well, what would you say are the priorities for government when implementing policy, whether that be at Scottish or UK level, aimed at tackling this kind of hate crime? What would be your suggestions to improve the outcomes for all religious groups? Mark, if you want to kick it off, but
sure. There's no shortage of legislation. I understand why we always come back to legislation, and I understand the importance of online. When I started at CSC in 1989. In 1989, and indeed in 1995, if you wanted to get your hands on extreme Nazi material, you had to already kind of be in an extreme Nazi group. You had to know where to send your postal order to. You had to somehow or other get it safely delivered to a PO box, and then you would get your extreme Nazi material. You already had to be in the circle to obtain it. Now, if you want that stuff, you go on your phone, or your kid goes on their phone, right? So the availability of incitement, extreme incitement, including footage of people being murdered in mosques, in synagogues, plus demands that someone goes out and tries to beat the high score. That's all out there. Anyone can find it. And the legislation needs to catch up with that. But in essence, the legislation exists. This is all about the lead, the moral lead that is given by politicians, and that moral lead includes the passing of legislation. But really, it's about implementation, and it's about saying this is a priority for policing, and this is a priority for prosecution. If it's not a priority for policing, then the evidence is not collected, the victims are not supported. You get into a vicious cycle of nobody reports the racism because there's no point in reporting it because nobody investigates it. So what's the point in the legislation? Similarly, if nobody ends up getting prosecuted, then what's the point in the legislation? Really, this is all about the determination of government and therefore the priorities that are set for policing and for prosecutors.
Duncan, do you have any thoughts on that? Especially, I'd be intrigued to hear how your work with the committees in the Scottish Government maybe played into your
Well, I mean, I really want to, agree again with Mark on this question of law, which is that, again, law is not the ceiling, it's the floor. In other words, you can build something on it, but it shouldn't be the limit of what you're trying to do. It's clear to me that that law has in some ways two really important functions. One is declaratory and setting the tone and making very clear what is and is not acceptable and where that boundary lies. And then secondary in providing, particularly where there are really egregious issues or where it's possible to get enough things together, evidence of redress and clarity around that, so you can ritually act that out and make clear that that's a consistency across. And I think, I know we'll probably come to it, but the notion of hate crime as not distinctive from the things that it does, but as something which is kind of like a cancer which attaches itself to things which are already cancerous, is quite interesting. In other words, it's an exacerbating factor. And something which takes it past the person into the person in their relationships. It really infects that kind of whole sense of who they are and their identity. So I think law is important. You always kind of can be heard wrongly when you talk about these things, but I'm also very clear that when we were particularly in some of the stuff about hate crime, there were two really important things I heard anyway, and so somebody can tell me it's not right, but certainly what we heard which was one, it was there is the kind of alarm of the very urgent and the very immediate and very real deep threat. But there's the everyday dull thud of humiliation. There is the being spat on because you're wearing a sari. There is being shouted at across the road. There's being hit and people walking away and nobody doing anything about it. There's a graffiti stuck on your door. There is all of these things. And then there is the court process, which is itself a really, really hard process with a very high threshold of evidence, in which going to it seems like awful. And then there are all sorts of realities, which are that the police or the people responsible for taking these things on don't really understand the depths of what this means, and it's dismissed, or it's seen as complaint, or it's persistently coming from one place or another. So it's extremely clear that if we're relying on law to sort out our problem, not going to be enough, which was why I was really happy that they talked about that we were given this long title of hate crime, prejudice and community cohesion, because I'm absolutely sure that you have to tackle it at all three levels at once. That the truth of this is that law, as I say, has a role, and it's important to get right, but it has to then set you off in dealing with preventive stuff. It has to set us off in dealing with the law as naming a real problem, which needs to be addressed in everything that we do. And I suppose if you're asking me then beyond getting the law right, certainly if governments pass law and then forget about it, it's no help. It's really no help whatsoever, because this is not something which is an event-driven activity. This is touching at something which is happening all the time in complex ways. So I suppose I think governments need to do now, and local government in particular, needs to be really on top of this. So one of the things we said, for example, was in Scotland you have community planning. Why is the thinking around where are we finding evidence of hate crime in this community, and who are the people who are feeling most at risk in this community, and how are we as a whole community dealing with this? Why is that not a persistent question for all of the agencies, education, police, health, government, local government? Why is that not something they report on every year? I think that's something that they could do, because they have things which are not laws. They're the resources, their training, their engagement with the communities, they are support for people who are at risk, they are safeguarding issues across the board, which can be different in different communities at different times, but can respond, for example, if there's a war in the Middle East, and are real about that and get into the middle of that, but at the same time are persistently dealing with this issue even when there isn't a war in the Middle East, because they're reconfining it and engaging with that. So I always thought that range of policy intervention, which is much more material. And then I think there is something here around our understanding of justice. One of the things which really struck me when we were talking about race hate crime was, there were two things. With the race, I'll give you two stories and then I'll stop. The race hate crime story was about that it was actually as hard for the isolated member of a targeted group in a small rural school as it was when there was 10 people in a urban school. And the isolation of that non-story, which never emerged, and nobody to go to. And the need to, and also this thing, which was when it was happening with children, I was interested, you said 1/3 of the stories were coming from schools. The intervention there, the criminal law isn't really is only marginally helpful there. Much more important is restorative justice. How do we actually confront those who are doing with this with what it is they are doing? How are teachers supported in that? How do schools develop restorative practices so that however early it happens, and it might be happening at age 10, it can be picked up and put somewhere else and given as a life lesson. And I think there are things around interventions in education. So I would say at the high level, the use of all our public resources through our community partners should be in it. At the more mundane level, or the very micro level, people who have access to people, the kind of restorative practices. The other one was community involvement in this and community spreading of this. One of the story came from somebody with learning disability who told us that you know, they had not gone out of the house for about 10 years because they had been attacked by bad boys. And the development of places of sanctuary and safety where people can go and be looked after became really important. And it turned out to be shops, GP surgeries, places where people could actually go, or in the community, and where people, even if they could not articulate their own issues, they could articulate somebody who could then articulate it. So the right to voice, the protection of voice around this stuff, and the right to voice, and the fact that that's given by the whole community, that the particular communities will use it, but the right in embedding the right to voice when this happens, because I think otherwise it feels like it's being suppressed, or it's too difficult, or you're not serious, and you're exaggerating, and actually it just creates greater trauma. It puts trauma on trauma on trauma on trauma for people. So that's just a number of issues: law, serious policy, proper training for professionals who have to deal with it, and innovative methods. Maybe the last thing I'd say is, and we have to be constantly thinking about what's the right thing, because I have the feeling sometimes that there's head-on confrontation and that has to happen. But sometimes change comes from here, when people are surprised. So developing constant ways to bring it to people's attention, which takes them by surprise, is sometimes very important as well.
Absolutely. I'm conscious that we could have a whole discussion on just how hate crime plays out in schools and how we get into that, but I don't want to go too far into that. I feel like we need to have a whole other day for that, and let's do that. I feel like we need to have that conversation. One of the questions we've had sent in was very similar to something I wanted to talk about anyway, but it kind of comes off the back of some of the bills and legislation that have been passed, which is the difficulties we sometimes have between defining hate speech and free speech, and how that plays out when people respond to legislation. So my question is, but feel free to just go off on what you think you want to talk about on this, is how do you draw the line between free speech and hate speech? I know everybody hates getting that question because it is such a complex one, but how do we draw the line between what's criminalized and what isn't, according to the legislation that we have in place just now?
I think it's only fair we should let Duncan go first for once.
Ha! Yes, I think it probably is, but I don't want it. It's this is well done.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, if we knew the answer to this question, we would all be doing it. So the problem we have here is that there's a margin in the middle, and the margin in the middle is embodied in the regulation of the press. You know, we all know that the press goes way beyond, and I'm not talking about hate crime here, I'm talking in general, and using this as an example, and then I'll try and take it into the hate crime area. We all know that the press destroys people's lives in some ways. It brings things to people. It uses stories for their own purposes. It sensationalizes when it needs to for ratings. It doesn't care. It's open season for anybody. It will use all sorts of methods. That's a fact of our democratic press. And then on the other side of it, we have the other fact, which is if we didn't have somewhere to put some of this stuff, none of it would ever come to light, and it would be closed down by interests and powers and people who had an interest in ensuring that nothing ever came to light of day. And in that grey space, there's something called ethics, and there's something called responsibility, and there's something called leadership, and there's something called testing it in courts, and all of those things. And I suppose I feel a little bit about this with hate crime, which is we have to, what we can't do is say there are no limits. We have to set some framework of limits and some frameworks of redress. So I'm absolutely clear about that. And so for me, the need to have some kind of hate crime legislation which recognizes that both the costs and consequences of some actions are targeted on people because of their identity and have a almost inevitable effect on traumatizing people who could next be the target. So all of that is, to me, needs to be somehow or other framed in legislation. On the other side, you have to be careful that that then isn't used simply by people to close down. So there has to be, in that space, I think, really important, robust conversations, really important exemplary cases, really important thinking. And sometimes, it's not a good answer, by the way. This is not a good answer. At least some people probably feeling that justice isn't done. It makes me feel that it keeps this conversation absolutely in the public domain. What I really insist is that this conversation is in the public domain. So that's maybe a halfway house answer, but the line then has to be drawn in changing what is acceptable in society. We really have to take that dead seriously. We have to take, and that again says after law, which sets you with your limit, there's a whole area which shouldn't be happening. And we get that, in all sorts of everyday reality. I mean, to take it out of hate crime, domestic relationships between men and women, there are limits in violence, and we've changed those limits, and we've made it much more zero tolerance in terms of physical violence than it was before. But we still have issues going on in this society which have to be negotiated, where it is complex. And I suppose that's all I will say to you is, in a democratic society, we have to insist on the right to talk about it. We have to try to increase the ethical awareness around it, and we have to ensure that the laws are robust.
Mark, do you want to come in with your thoughts on that point as well?
Yeah, a lot of what was said. Well, I don't know where the line should be drawn, because the line is basically drawn wherever government feels that society kind of meets it and demands, and how things have shifted and changed over time. So the first ever Race Relations Act was much, much harder to imagine and push through than all the subsequent legislation. And we talk about freedom of speech as if it's an absolute right, but it never really has been, and perhaps nor should it be. If you go, for example, to some of the stuff that I see online, which is permitted under American legislation, and is the reason why we are given as to why certain things cannot be removed. I think it's really, really important, the online aspect of this. Okay, we live in a global village. I keep coming back to my point about 20 years ago, if you wanted to get your hands on the most extreme anything, whether it's racist or sexual or just violent and nasty or whatever, you had to already be in a circle of like-minded people to be able to get hold of it. Nowadays, it's all on your phone. And my first demand is that it's the government that I elect, because I live in a democracy, is that it's the government that decides what is acceptable for me, my kids, and anyone else to see on their phones, rather than Facebook. I didn't elect Facebook to decide this for me. I didn't elect Twitter. I didn't elect anybody else. And I've had this argument with Facebook representatives, senior Facebook representatives, when they've said to me, well, hold on a minute, we can't censor what people say, because what if the Chinese government want us to censor something about Tibet? And I'm saying, well, to be honest, your issue with the Chinese government is not my concern. My concern is what's available here and now on Facebook. Now, as it happens, the social media giants have all come a huge distance, right? When Donald Trump got elected, all of a sudden, Facebook and Twitter, their operating paradigms of freedom of speech shifted somewhat, because their Californian certainties suddenly disappeared, right? So this freedom of speech thing is utterly elastic anyway, depending upon who's setting the boundaries. Secondly, when we talk about legislation, Duncan said before, and it reminded me about the difficulty of negotiating the hate crime system. So CST brought out this hate crime, a guide for those affected, and we did it in partnership with Tell Mama, which is the Muslim hate crime organization I mentioned before, DCLG, and Crown Prosecution Service. And in here we explain in plain English what your rights are, how you report. Literally, there's a picture of what the inside of a courtroom looks like. And we've also got a list of all the things that it could be heard under. I'm not going to read it all out, but Public Order Act 1986, Section 4, 4 points from that. Public Order Act 1986, Section 4A and 5, 6 points from that. Crime and Disorder Act 1998, 3 points. 1 point from the Criminal Justice Act 2003. 1 point from the Public Order Act 1986, Part 3. 4 parts from the Racial and Religious Hatred Act 2006, Part 3A, Section 29. 2 things from the Football Offences Act. 2 things from the Malicious Communications Act 1998. 2 from the Communications Act 2003. And 4 from Protection from Harassment. Right? So when we talk about the dividing lines between freedom of speech and hate speech, and all of those things that I just reeled off already exist. And I don't think we're particularly suffering from an absence of freedom of speech in the UK, at least. I also want to add though something really, really important, which is the definition of extremism. And extremism, stuff that is permitted, that is extreme, by definition, it's not yet illegal. It's floating below. It's in that gray zone. It's not yet illegal because if it was illegal, the people that do it would be taken into prison, right? But all of the stuff that is extremist, that gives rise, that allows the stuff that Duncan's been talking about and that I've been talking about, that's where the impossibility lies between freedom of speech and protection from that freedom of speech. Because what we define as extremist, and when we give government the license in a democracy at least, to intervene with young people in particular, and to say that young person needs to get put into the Prevent program or the Channel program or whatever other counter-extremism program we have at the moment. And there will always need to be these counter-extremism programs. I believe that very firmly. And they will always look pretty much like what they currently look like. I think that also. So I'm not getting into the detail of which ones are right and which ones are wrong. But this question of extremism and when extremist behavior marks you out as a potential terrorist when you get a bit older, and when it justifies legal action, it's impossible to make a clean line on this. It will always be.
I agree with a lot of what you're saying. The on the social media thing, I think the anonymity issue is really problematic.
Correct.
And I think at the very minimum, traceability. People should be traceable by the publishers. In other words, there may be some reasons why some people can't say things straight out, but those should be manageable by the owners of the platforms. So I think that this notion that you can come out of the woodwork, fire a missile at somebody, which sets off a fire, and then disappear again, is becoming really kind of normative and is becoming almost fun. We have to understand that as long as violence doesn't hurt you, it's considered exciting. And so the notion of the social media is you can have a big row and there's no consequences, but we know now that's not true. I mean, you just look at the level of personal vitriol and the health consequences for people are visible, but not just that, the permissive environment that it creates and all sorts of things, the real world consequences. So I think, that's one thing. The second thing, which I think is interesting from a discussion on religion, is what is our public discussion on ethics? Because some of this has to be self-regulation as well as, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and what is acceptable. There's laws and there's ethics. There are internalized ways of understanding the value of the other human being which always historically and in traditions came out of the religious discourse. And in, I mean, Judaism was a debating tradition. It was a freedom of speech tradition. It was a, you know, there's a wrestling around it going on in different things. And I think in some ways Christianity, by trying to make absolute laws out of this thing, is the one who took it off in the wrong direction here, rather than trying to turn it into a place for discourse. And the seriousness of the need for an ethical discussion all the time. I'm not sure where we get it now, because I'm not sure that we know the difference between being moralistic and having a moral framework. You know, that there's something about being moralistic which is catastrophic, but there's something about having a legitimate space for a moral discourse that the children and young people and parents and everybody else is part of, and that takes you outside that, you know, into that loop. I think that's a piece of the educational and public space we have to think about in an increasingly diverse society. How do we have that conversation with each other?
Absolutely. I know this discussion could go on for hours. I'm conscious I want to make sure that our audience get a chance to ask questions. I know we've got a couple coming in, and if anybody does want to unmute and ask a question, please do just either raise your hand digitally or frantically wave at the camera. I'm sure we'll see you. But I would like to start off by asking Frank Angel, who I believe had a question, is able to unmute and ask his question. Thank you, Frank.
Right, I'm unmuted. Unfortunately, I can't. My video won't start. You've blocked my video. Doesn't matter. I will just appear in sound. First of all, thanks, Kirsty, and thanks, Duncan and Mark. I'm minded that the Jesuits had the principle of give me a child till 7 and I can educate him. And also, having been very impressed years ago to have read Hans Paul Richter's book Friedrich, which explained to young German children how anti-Semitism was growing under Nazi Germany, I wonder what we can do about starting this sort of education in primary schools, because we have a mixture of faith and non-faith schools. What can be done to try and arrange some socialization between the different groups in these schools, and what sort of education is appropriate to them? Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
This has been a big conversation, I suppose, in all societies where you know, what do we teach our children and how do we teach our children? So first thing, I'm absolutely sure that the focus of education is a little. First of all, I want to shift, for the beginning of this conversation anyway, away from the structure to the task, and the task has to be made clear, which is that children in our care who grow up and arrive at adulthood need to have the tools and the ability to live in the world that they live in and to contribute to it in a active and ethical way. So that means that, taking that principle, this is a proper topic of education. That's the first thing. The second thing is that what that looks like for a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old is going to be different, and the content of it has to be different, but we need it to be part of what education in its best sense is about. And I think then there is a conversation around what's legitimate in the school, what is the community's job, what is the parents' job, and there are a whole lot of conversations that come out of our knowledge around all of that. What I would say, in Northern Ireland, we've had this conversation, and I am, just full disclosure, I'm on the board of the Integrated Education Movement. And all my children went through integrated education. And I suppose I think what integrated education, though, has to be thought of really carefully, because I think we live mostly in a system here which is very divided on Catholic Protestant grounds, which means that children come out not only in their social relationships, but in what they consider normal, their normal frames of reference, and their expectations of who's going to not like them, and if they've worn uniform, who actually will attack them, and so on, have been ingrained from quite an early space. So that's definitely a downside. On the other hand, it gives people a sense of who they belong to, their identity, and so on. So I have come to the conclusion, we've come to the conclusion in a bit of work we did, which is that these questions of equity, they're treating people with due respect and with fairness. The question of difference and diversity, in other words, what is legitimate? It is okay for people to have traditions and to bring those traditions into the space, and for their children to be part of those traditions. And then this question of how do we, in this modern world, acknowledge our interdependence and prepare ourselves to contribute to it and in it. So you can, if you skin the cat by having your school as an integrated school, your challenge is actually, how do we allow people to have those conversations from traditions? Where's the space of that? How does difference be given its acknowledgement? If you do it the other way around, you have to skin the cat the other way, which is that all of the normative experiences will be within, and how do we build against the risk of that? And so I've come to the conclusion that what you say needs to be a really upfront question of education, and we need to stop deluding ourselves if the ultimate purpose is that the children who come out at the other end have the tools and the relationships and the confidence to be able to engage in a society in which they have their own sense of themselves, and but that they're constantly in engagement with others.
Thanks, Duncan. Mark, have you got anything to add to that point?
Look, this is difficult for me because I'm chief exec of one of the leading Jewish communal organizations, and I'm not going to say that the Jewish schools are a bad thing.
No.
Per se, right? I'm not going to say that, and I don't believe it. However, one of the things about so many Jewish kids in England, not in Scotland, but in England, being within Jewish schools, I say in England from a secondary school perspective, is that therefore, obviously these Jewish kids are not interacting with non-Jewish kids, and vice versa, which is very, very important and is always forgotten. The non-Jewish kids are therefore not interacting with Jewish kids, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously that will have consequences on, some of these things. Now, I don't want to get too personal about this, but when I moved from Glasgow to London, I was really, really struck by the fact that the area of London that I live and work in, to me, feels more genuinely multicultural than just about anywhere I've been in the world, right? And when I come back to Glasgow, I feel a bit more tolerated than I do when I'm in my North London bubble. By tolerated, I basically mean that people put up with me. When I'm in my North London bubble, I feel like I'm in a really genuinely cosmopolitan space in which just everybody is different. Everybody comes from somewhere. Nobody really cares where you come from. That's how I feel about it. And by the way, when I get on the metro in Brussels, which I do quite often, or used to, I really, really feel like that is a space that is not multicultural at all, mm-hmm. Right? I really feel when I'm in some of these West European capital cities that actually the stratification of society based upon race and ethnicity and religion is far worse,
yeah,
than we have in Britain. much worse than in Glasgow, much worse. So I don't really know what I'm saying here about the question that Frank rightly asked. I guess what I'm saying is that, yeah, opportunities for children to mix with each other and for children to learn about each other's cultures and each other's festivals ought to help to immunize a bit against this. But the thing that upsets me the most about everything that we've seen at CST during the month of May and the surge of anti-Semitic verbal mainly is that so much of it happened in schools.
Yeah.
And it happened in schools that previously I, perhaps naively, would have said were part of my wonderful North London cosmopolitan bubble that I've just described. But actually, no. Because when this conflict occurs overseas and you are characterized as being on the side of evil, then not only do you get it in the neck, but you deserve to get it in the neck.
Yeah.
Right? And that is where this business of the international impacting upon the local and living in a globalized world with all the social media stuff becomes very, very important. And yeah, we should educate as best we can. Will it work as a prophylactic against this? No, it won't. But hopefully it should help a wee bit.
Thanks, both. I think I've got quite a
Thanks from me as well.
Thanks, Frank. I think we've got quite a complementary question to that discussion coming up next. So Sarah, if you're able to unmute and ask your question, thank you.
Hiya, Sarah here. I work for YouthLink Scotland, the National Agency for Youth Work. So this question might be quite typical, and I'm pretty sure I've asked Duncan it before. Maybe in a slightly different context. Yeah. But I mean, you've talked a lot about education, and then Mark, you've mentioned that a lot of what happened in May happened in schools. But we have been talking about education in relation to schools and teachers' roles in tackling hate crime and tackling prejudice. But there are a lot of young people who don't engage with school, you just mentioned earlier about the people who perpetrators respect being the ones to prevent or to use language that I'm trying to work out the words now. I've got a baby on my lap, so it's got my head. But people who perpetrators respect being the ones to pass on the messages of unacceptability of certain behaviours and certain language. Now, for a lot of young people, that might be youth workers. So I was wondering where you saw youth work playing a role in terms of bringing communities together, about essentially educating young people in a sort of non-formal education sense. Does that make sense for a very long question?
I said already in passing about the stand-up initiative that CST pays for, and it's done in conjunction with a Jewish youth group called Maccabi. And it's a very, very important program for us. I come from a youth group background, and I believe very, very strongly in the power of informal education through youth leadership. I think it's hugely important, especially in the setting of ethics. And I would encourage it again and again and again. I would encourage it.
I mean, Sarah knows this, but I'm a complete fan. I actually think we call it for the moment informal education, but it may just be an informal support space or an informal framework within which young people are able to negotiate these things, is utterly critical for our society and for the ways in which these things happen. Again, school classrooms tend to dispense right and wrong answers, laws and so on. Youth work tends to deal in complexity, in reality, in very complex ways in which things move together. But it's also, I think, a source of huge knowledge and learning about what anti-Semitism, what racism, what Islamophobia, what sectarianism, what do these things actually look like once they stop being things that are discussed, but are actually experienced in real situations, whether it's as speech or as behavior or as structure or as myths that are stories. And I think an engagement, one of the things that really, in terms of story hearing, one of the things I think good youth work, good community work really does is listen to the people who are who are, you know, in the middle of their space, rather than simply teach them and respond to that. And I think actually that I suppose we're going back to this all the time, which is that these things are part of an ecology of relationships, which have to be tackled at all the different points at which we see them. They're not just part of they're not just a thing which can be turned off with a single switch, because they're not a top-down experience. They're a top-down, sideways, all sorts of things response. And they live in our societies in very complicated ways. And I think youth work and the youth work approach and the informal approach and giving value to that. Just to give you one very practical example of that, we talked about this in slightly earlier. I referred to it, the difference between hate crime and hate incidents. Crime is a very formal definition, in fact, of it goes past a certain point. It can be proved in a court of law. It has a frame of formal reference. But hate incidents probably take up 90% of what really people experience as that. And I think we have to have more tools and more ways to engage and address and acknowledge and measure and work from and learn from and respond to. And at that point, the formal education system acts a bit like the law. We need to have it, and it needs to be doing its job, but relying on it and seeing it as the end rather than the beginning of your frame, or isolated within a wider context, is a mistake. And therefore I'm a big supporter of youth work and its many techniques, because it's not a single thing either. You know, what is quite interesting about it is it's always thinking about what is the best way to communicate with young people, not just what do we communicate, but in what way can a story be heard. And that has to shift and change and alter, because if it becomes too patterned, the pattern itself is the problem. So you have to shift the pattern. So I'm all for it. And I think also that the learned experience of people who've had to work in those environments is often the first place you start in starting to identify these things. I remember in part of our work, I think it may have been somebody from your organization, but who spoke and said, you know, social media is two things. First of all, it's evidence of something that's going on in our society, but you need to listen to it to be able to understand where the poison actually is. It's also a learning tool. And there's no point in just talking about young people and they should be stopped saying those things. That's one part of it, but there's another part, which is they're saying those things. We need to pay attention that's where the hate's going. So there's a learning element in that as well.
I think that might have been Tim.
Yes, I think it was Tim. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've got two more questions. I'd ask that we keep questions and, Duncan, remarks and answers a little shorter, because I'd quite like to see if we can get finished up before 8 tonight. But thank you so much for all your insightful comments so far. I'd like to hand over to Colin.
9, I assume you mean 9.
9, oh, well, yeah. 9, I could keep talking for hours. Maybe I'm going to go to 8 in the morning, who knows. But Colin, if you'd like to pick up for the next question.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. This question is directed mainly to Mark, but Duncan, if you feel you want to contribute, that would be also very interesting. Mark, many people I speak to say that they are not anti-Jewish, but that they are anti-Zionist. Is that a tenable position for them to hold?
Did you say tenable or terrible?
Tenable.
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 Yeah, look, it's tenable in the sense that in a world of theory, it's possible to be anti-Zionist and universally opposed to all nationalisms and therefore you're not just singling out Jews to be against their self-determination, so therefore it kind of might be anti-Jewish in one sense, but it's not singling out, so therefore, you know, they don't mean it like that. But in the real world, if you looked at anti-Zionism from the extreme left and the extreme right and Islamists, very often you wouldn't even be able to tell which one of these three supposedly very disparate ideologies the anti-Zionism had come from. And the reason for that is because the anti-Zionism that they perpetrate is not anti-Zionism in the sense of some kind of principled opposition to the notion of self-determination for different peoples. Rather, it portrays the word Zionism and imagines the word Zionism essentially in the same way that Mosley used to say that he was against big Jews, not little Jews. He didn't care about Jewish tailors, Jewish dentists. He cared about the Jews who ran the media. He cared about the Jews whose money power ran the politicians, right? So he said he wasn't anti-Jewish per se. It's the same thing. You can only understand the way that the word Zionist is used nowadays across these disparate political ideologies. You can only understand them, make sense of them, if you understand how the word Jew was used by anti-Semites in the first half of the 20th century. Because essentially, it's exactly the same utility, but with the word Jew replaced by the word Zionist. And Duncan spoke earlier about the way that these hatreds reflected the psychological need of the hater rather than the actual behavior of the target. That's what anti-Zionism does. Anti-Zionism fulfills the need, the anti-Semitic imagination, the need for a scapegoat that used to be called a Jew and now is called a Zionist. That's the only way to make sense of the way that 99% of the anti-Zionism that is out there, what it actually looks like. So I don't know if that makes it tenable or not.
It makes it interesting.
I just, the only thing I want to add is to look at it from the other end of the telescope, which is, given the context we are in and the kind of license that it seeks to create for some things rather than other things, you know what I mean? The test is usually put to me anyway as, you know, that's intellectually coherent, which at some level or others, Mark says it is. Of course it is. You can say this is this list I agree with, this list I don't agree with. That's all right. The difficulty is, I think in the real world, I would want to say, and what difference does that make to what you do and what you feel and what you are going to say? Because I think it becomes very easy to make that distinction, to let yourself off the consequences from the other side of that. So it's not that I don't think, you know, you can oppose anything. I can be anti-communist and, you know, in some sense, or I don't agree with his ideology. There are anti-Zionist Jewish people, you know, that's possible. It is that we have to be serious about the consequences of that and about the too easy way of saying that. And I think that's where the challenge back is. So what difference does that make? What difference does that make? Because I think quite quickly, it's quite hard to see, quite hard to tell.
Thank you both. Conscious of time, so I'd like to hand over to Kirsten Oswald MP for hopefully a very brief question. Thank you, Kirsten. Sorry to push you into that.
No, that's okay. I'll try and be very brief. And thanks to both Mark and Duncan for really interesting discussion. I actually think it's one of the most important discussions that we need to have and we need to keep having. So I'm going to just cut to the chase, I think, with the thing that I'm interested in all of this, which has been really important. I wonder where the slightly less obvious bits of the online world sit. I'm really aware of some of the online discourse that's influenced by people or narratives that aren't immediately obvious to us, and they can amplify and multiply some really unpleasant things. And part of it is about that amplification and multiplication, but part of it is about the narrative and who's driving it too. And in all of the really important things that I've heard tonight about how we can support positive capacity building in this really important discussion, I wonder how we do that, knowing that there may be people who are minded to and have the ability to influence things in ways that I certainly don't adequately understand. And I wonder how much either of you have looked into that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, it's a really, really important question, and it's really difficult to answer. But Kirsten, thank you for being with us tonight. It's really important. Thank you. The research, such as it is primarily into hate speech rather than anti-hate speech. And the research shows that hate speech has a life expectancy that is far, far shorter, actually, than anti-hate speech. We've done all this work, and we've done numerous studies on it. Basically, anti-hate speech stays up, whereas hate speech gets removed sooner or later if the right person reports it to the right person within the social media company, which generally CST is able to do. But the general public need to be able to do it. And the social media giants need to spend enough money employing enough people so that anybody can report it, and it doesn't just need to be me and a select couple of colleagues who know what number to call. The importance here of anti-racist messaging, of positivity, we've tried to put out this kind of messaging from CST, although not obviously with our name on it always, because then it becomes a case of they would say that, wouldn't they? So you try to find champions who are not the usual suspects to say it. We did a campaign that had, you know, a nurse, a street cleaner, and a couple of other non-obvious subjects standing up, saying, oppose anti-Semitism, oppose racism. It was very straightforward messaging. It went down really well. I think there's a far greater uptake for anti-racist messaging, anti-hate messaging than any of us appreciate, primarily because it's not news, right? It's a good news story, so nobody covers it. And you have to find it in the detail of the story. So, for example, when Marcus Rashford gets deluged with racist hatred, the excuse trigger being that he misses a penalty for England. I doubt you got many hate messages from Scotland, by the way. You know all about the hatred, but you have to dig deep into the story 2 or 3 days later to hear about actually all the messages of positivity that it received in response to that. And in a sense, the story has moved on. It would be great if the media, and actually all of us, because the media report what they think we want to consume, paid as much attention to the positivity as to the negativity. I don't know if that's answered your question or if it's just a little waffle. I'm sorry.
I mean, to me, there's like so many different aspects to your question. I think it's really, you know, it's, first of all, it's like very, very hard if we knew the answer to the question, we should all do it. But I mean, alongside, and this is not to set aside, I actually think what you said there about how we think about how stories are told and how in this space is really important, and those stories. The two things I have in my head are a little bit more, I don't know if they're more realistic or less. They're not less realistic, certainly. Sorry, they're not more realistic. They might be less realistic. The one is, I think at the level of power politics, we have to be very, very deadly serious about it and analyze them and take them seriously. And I think that is something to hand back to you, I suppose, but is that we need to bottom out what the meaning of these things are. I think we've lived in the era of fake news. We've watched as powers have tried to intervene internationally. We know that this is happening now. We can see the really complex debates it sets up. For example, just even thinking of the Uyghurs in China, how do you respond to that kind of reality, which we kind of know, or we do know is happening, but how do you fit that in against all the other stuff? And what is, and I don't envy your job, but I think we have to be serious about it. And it's part of that ethics, and what is where does that fit into that conversation? But it is at a level of politics and a level of information and a level of intelligence, which, is really quite serious. And we have to develop a serious discourse in our politics around this. And I think that's honest. The other one is the other way around, which is the most flimsy of the lot, really. But to me, it's a bit like your, Mark's thing about peace and salam and shalom at the beginning, which is the ultimate ethical conversation is the place of the human being in the middle, is paradoxically the vulnerability of the human being and the value of the vulnerable human being in the middle of all of that, in the face of exactly that kind of totally unmeasurable type of deliberate conspiratorial political evil. And I think that there's something around insisting on a moral discourse which constantly goes back to that, which constantly starts again from the contrast of what you've just identified, this kind of background, dark web, all that kind of stuff, against what it is we're trying to allow to flourish here. So there's something in the positive and the negative in that, which to me is not about unrealism or romanticism. It's actually about what the struggle at the heart is actually about. And I think that's why this conversation matters, because I think in hate crime, you see one of the manifestations of where that's played out in people's real lives, the choices between what matters here, the ideological or the person. And I think actually that's one of the reasons why this conversation is so important.
Thank you, Duncan. And I think on that note, it'd be a really powerful note to sort of end this on. And from me, thank you both Mark and Duncan for all of your wonderful contributions. I know this discussion could go on for hours, if not days. I'd like to hand over now to give some brief closing remarks to Dr. Maureen Sire, Director of Interfaith Scotland, who I think is a really powerful contribution to this discussion and to close our event. So Maureen, thank you so much, and thank you Mark and Duncan from myself and us at SCoJeC for all your hard work.
Thank you, Kirsty. And actually, this is probably one of the hardest jobs I've ever had. I've got 3 pages of notes, and I'm sure everyone's really tired and absolutely don't want me to share my 3 pages of notes, because it's been such a rich, informative, challenging, it's been a fantastic evening. So it's really a great pleasure just to say a few words, and I'm going to try to summarise about this evening's event and to offer the vote of thanks on behalf of SCoJeC. And actually, I want to begin by thanking SCoJeC for hosting such an informative and challenging event. It was quite brave of you to do it, and I think it's gone remarkably well. And to thank the 3 presenters this evening, Anas Sarwar, MSP, Mark Gardner from CST, and Professor Duncan Morrow from Ulster University. I'm going to just say a few words, first of all, about the video from Anas, because I really feel he set the scene, and I want to thank him for that. I'm sure everyone would wish also to thank Anas for taking the time on his holiday to prepare such an insightful video. Some of the key points that he mentioned were that we need true education, we need to build solidarity through our education system, we also need to build solidarity between communities, and to challenge prejudice and hate in all its forms. He actually went on to show very clearly that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia come from the same well of hate, the same place of ignorance, and the same place of prejudice. So thanks, Anas, for the video, and I hope we'll see you face to face soon. And I want to say that I'm sure everyone present will actually have taken so much from the evening. I know I have. The conversation has been rich and impactful. The stories that both Duncan and Mark shared from their childhood experiences and their youth were meaningful and personal. And so I want to say personally, thank you for that. I think that's really important to sort of see you as people and how it's framed, who you are and the great contributions that you make to society. So that was great. But thanks don't end there. There were so many key points that I'm sure resonated with everyone present. And I felt that both of you were speaking from long, deep and insightful engagement. And without wanting to sound overly religious, being the director of Interfaith Scotland, I think that there was truth spoken tonight. There was truth and clarity, and really thank you for that. There was such a lot that you said that will really have resonated with people. Duncan, you mentioned that law is not the ceiling, it is the floor. That was just a great statement. It really set the tone for what is and what is not acceptable. You spoke of the need for evidence, for redress, for clarity. You spoke about the need for good resources, training, safeguarding, education, policy intervention, restorative justice, restorative practices, community involvement, the right to voice and the protection of people's voices, developing constant ways to take people by surprise. Spoke about free speech. I'm going to also touch on what Mark said about the media. But you also said that the press can destroy people's lives and sensationalizes, and somehow it becomes an open season. It's just a fact of democracy, and that maybe needs to be looked at and thought about. Spoke about the need for ethics, leadership, how we need to set limits and frameworks, limits around the press and other areas of speech, the need for places of sanctuary and safety in the community, the need for a moral framework and ethics. I mean, I could go on. I mean, it was just so rich that it was very difficult to summarize it. Mark, you highlighted the critical issue of identity. Identity politics in some way as well, particularly when you shared the story of the hurtful world. So you're not really Scottish. The power of words to set people apart and to separate them. And we all know that happened during the Holocaust and subsequent genocides, the idea of using words to make people other to other people. It's just very powerful. Again, you also spoke about the need for great leadership and how leadership must show that hatred is unacceptable. Actually, you were the only person that mentioned interfaith work as being needed to build relationships. So thank you, because I think it's really, really critically important. And Duncan, you might like to know that in 10 days' time, I'll be in Northern Ireland meeting with the Northern Irish Interfaith Forum. We're going to submit a funding application to get them some funds to do some more, to do some work. So maybe we could touch base with you face to face while we're working on that, because I think there's a lot of really critical work to be done. Mark, you also highlighted online hatred and governments catching up with this. And I think parents and educators and all sorts of people need to catch up with this. It's just what is actually accessible to young people. They're saying people as young as 8 can access some terrible things online. And yeah, that is a lot that needs to be challenged there. You also spoke about the importance of counter-extremism programs, and you shared with us the fantastic educational work that CST has been doing. So thank you for that. Duncan, you mentioned that sometimes people cannot speak their truth in case of tripping the wire. And I think that's really stayed with me. And often in interfaith relations, we talk about people speaking the truth of what they believe and feeling that they're in a safe space to do that, and to be who they are, and to feel that their identity is precious, but not to feel that that has to be held up in contrast or in opposition to someone else's identity. So that really spoke to me, that idea of speaking your truth without fear of tripping the wire. And I'm sure you meant it in all sorts of other ways, but it was a very powerful expression. I could go on and on. It's like 3 minutes to 9. You've all been here for 2 hours. So again, thank you so much to SCoJeC. Thank you so much to the 3 presenters tonight. And I'm sure we'll get the typed up notes of this recording, and there'll have been an awful lot more captured than I could ever have done in a brief summary. So thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Maureen, and thank you everybody for joining us. And with that, thank you, Duncan, Mark, and I'd like to draw this event to a close. Thank you so much for joining us.